My brother invited me to his wedding as the brother who had practically helped raise him. But the name card at my seat read, Uneducated Freeloader Brother. The bride's entire family laughed like it was part of the entertainment. Then her brother smirked and added, So this is the embarrassing relative we heard about. I was ready to swallow it and walk out quietly, until my brother grabbed my arm, looked straight at his future father-in-law and said, What you did to my brother tonight will be the most expensive insult of your life. Thank you for being here. Please comment the letter Y, so I know you are ready and listen to me tell the whole story. The rehearsal dinner was held in a private dining room at a high-end restaurant downtown, the kind of place with valet parking, crystal chandeliers, and waiters wearing better suits than I had ever owned in my life. I walked in feeling a little out of place, adjusting my collar, just happy to be there for Carter. He is my younger brother. He is the kid I taught how to throw a baseball, the kid I stayed up with when he had a fever, the man I was so incredibly proud of. This night was supposed to be a celebration of his future. I found the table assigned to the immediate family. I walked over, offering a polite nod to David, the bride's father, who was holding a glass of scotch and holding court with some business partners. He barely registered my existence, offering a tight, dismissive smile before turning away. I was used to that. I looked down at the table to find my seat. The heavy, cream-colored cardstock was folded neatly above my dinner plate, written in elegant gold calligraphy. I leaned in to read my name. It did not say Elijah. It said, Uneducated Freeloader Brother. For a second, my brain completely stopped working. The letters blurred together. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim, romantic lighting of the restaurant. I blinked hard, but the ink stayed exactly the same. Uneducated. Freeloader. Brother. A sharp, cruel chuckle broke my silence. I looked up. Sitting directly across from me was Julian, the bride's older brother. He was leaning back in his velvet chair, swirling a glass of red wine, a smug grin plastered across his face. He nudged his mother, Sarah, who covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent laughter. Julian set his glass down. So this is the embarrassing relative we heard about, he said, his voice carrying just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. I guess they really will let anyone into these places nowadays. The blood rushed to my ears. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. A thick, suffocating heat climbed up my neck. I looked around the table. David was watching me with a cold, calculating gaze, completely unbothered by his son's behavior. The bride, Chloe, looked down at her lap, her face pale, completely paralyzed by her family's cruelty. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to flip the table, to grab Julian by his expensive silk tie and show him exactly what an uneducated man with calloused hands could do. But I looked at Carter, my little brother. He looked absolutely devastated. His face went entirely white, his eyes darting from the card to me, then to his future in-laws. I did what I had always done my entire life. I swallowed my pride. I took a step back, ready to turn around and walk out the door. I was not going to ruin my brother's wedding weekend over a piece of paper. But before I could even pivot my heel, Carter's hand clamped down on my forearm like a vice. His grip was shaking, not from fear, but from an anger so deep it terrified me. He did not look at Julian. He looked directly at David, the patriarch, the man who had clearly approved of this humiliation. What you did to my brother tonight, Carter said, his voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of his usual warmth, will be the most expensive insult of your life. But before I tell you what Carter did next, and how that one sentence brought an entire empire crashing down, you need to understand exactly why a 33-year-old man with dirt permanently stained under his fingernails was standing in a room full of millionaires, willing to let them treat him like garbage. 2 hours before that dinner, I was standing in the bathroom of my hotel room, struggling with a tie. I am not a suit and tie kind of guy. I am a steel-toe boots, heavy denim, and safety glasses kind of guy. As I fumbled with the silk fabric, I caught sight of my own hands in the mirror. They are rough. The knuckles are thick, scarred from years of slipped wrenches and jagged sheet metal. The calluses on my palms are hard as stone. I traced a long, faded scar across my thumb, and my mind instantly went back 18 years. I was 15 when the police knocked on our front door. Carter was 7, sitting on the rug watching cartoons. The officer took off his hat and told me there had been an accident on the interstate. Both of our parents were gone. Just like that. The funeral was a blur of cheap black clothes and pitying looks from neighbors who brought casseroles but offered no real help. We had nothing. My parents were good people, but they lived paycheck to paycheck. There was no massive inheritance waiting for us. There was barely enough to cover the burial. Child Protective Services got involved, and the threat of foster care hung over us like a dark cloud. I remember looking at Carter, who was holding my leg, crying for our mom, and I made a decision that shaped the rest of my life. I was a straight-A student. I had dreams. I had a small college fund my dad had started with $10 deposits every month. I took that paperwork, shoved it into a drawer, and never looked at it again. I went down to the local construction yard the day after the funeral. I lied about my age. I told the foreman I was 18 and desperate. He looked at my skinny arms, handed me a shovel, and pointed to a pile of gravel. I dug trenches until my hands bled. I carried lumber until my spine felt like it was going to snap in half. I worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, bringing home a meager salary that barely kept the lights on and food in our refrigerator. I became a father to my brother when I was still a kid myself. I went to his parent-teacher conferences covered in drywall dust. I checked his math homework with fingers stained with motor oil. I made sure he had clean clothes, hot meals, and a safe place to sleep. I protected him from the ugly reality of our situation. When things got really tight, I would tell him I already ate at work so he could have the last piece of chicken. I never told him about the eviction notices I tore up, or the time I fought tooth and nail with the city over custody, proving to a judge that a high school dropout could provide a stable home for a little boy. And it worked. Carter was brilliant. He went to college on a full scholarship, got his degree, and landed an incredible job at a top-tier tech firm. He got a massive promotion just 2 years out of school. He bought nice suits, went to fancy dinners, and eventually he met Chloe. I never wanted anything in return. Seeing him succeed was my paycheck. Seeing him happy was my college degree. I built a successful contracting business over the years. I started with a used pickup truck and a box of rusty tools, and eventually grew it into a massive commercial real estate development firm. But I kept it quiet. I still drove my old truck. I still wore my work boots. Carter knew I did okay, but he had no idea about the actual scale of my company. I did not want him to feel like he owed me anything, and I certainly did not want his new, wealthy in-laws to think I was trying to compete with them. I just wanted to be the proud older brother. But as I washed my hands in that hotel sink, scrubbing at grease that would never come off, I felt a heavy knot in my stomach. The family I was about to have dinner with did not care about sacrifice. They only cared about zip codes and bank accounts. I knew this dinner was going to be a disaster because I had already met David and Sarah 6 months prior. Carter had invited me to a nice steakhouse to officially meet his future in-laws. I showed up early, wearing a clean button-down shirt and dress pants. I watched them pull up to the valet stand in a brand new Porsche. David stepped out, tossing the keys to the kid without even looking at him. He wore a custom-tailored suit and a watch that probably cost more than my first house. Sarah was dripping in jewelry, holding her designer bag like a shield. When Carter introduced us, David looked me up and down. His eyes stopped on my boots, then traveled up to my hands, and finally settled on my face. He extended a hand. His grip was weak, limp, the handshake of a man who never had to do heavy lifting. "Elijah," David said, dragging my name out. "Carter has told us so much about you. He said you work in construction?" The way he said the word construction sounded like he was talking about a disease. "Yes, sir," I replied politely. "I'm a general contractor." "Fascinating," Sarah chimed in, taking a sip of her sparkling water. "It must be so exhausting, doing all that manual labor." "Julian, our son, is in finance. He manages hedge funds. It requires a very different kind of intellect. I smiled and nodded, letting the insults slide right off my back. That sounds like a great career. Carter is doing very well at his firm, too. He just got a big promotion. David waved his hand dismissively. Yes, Carter is a bright boy. But of course, marrying into our family will open doors for him that he could never access on his own. We are very protective of our circle, Elijah. I'm sure you understand. We value education, pedigree, and certain standards. He spent the rest of the dinner talking about his investments, his golf club memberships, and his summer home in the Hamptons. He never asked me a single question about my life. Whenever Carter tried to bring up a story about our childhood, David would quickly change the subject, clearly uncomfortable with the fact that his future son-in-law grew up eating generic brand cereal in a drafty apartment. When the bill came, I reached for my wallet. David actually let out a short, patronizing laugh. "Put that away, Elijah," he said, slapping his platinum credit card onto the leather tray. "I think this dinner is a little outside your normal salary bracket. Let the adults handle it." I looked at Carter. He looked incredibly embarrassed, opening his mouth to defend me, but I shook my head slightly. I gave him a look that said, "Let it go. Don't fight him on this." I walked out of that restaurant feeling like I had been dipped in dirt. It was not just the arrogance. It was the absolute certainty David had that he was a superior human being simply because he wore a nicer suit. He looked at me and saw a peasant. He saw a liability. But what bothered me the most was the way they looked at Carter. They did not see a brilliant, kind young man who had overcome incredible odds. They saw a charity case. They saw someone they could mold and control with their money. I told myself I could handle it. I told myself I only had to endure their snobbery a few times a year for the holidays. As long as Carter loved Chloe, and she loved him, I would bite my tongue and play the role of the quiet, simple-minded brother. But I did not know that David was not just an arrogant snob. He was a manipulative coward, and he had someone feeding him lies about me. The real poison in this situation did not start with David. It started with Dylan. Dylan was one of Carter's groomsmen. They went to college together. Dylan was the kind of guy who always wore boat shoes, talked loudly about his fraternity days, and constantly name-dropped people he barely knew. I never liked him, but Carter is loyal to a fault and considered him a good friend. About 3 weeks before the rehearsal dinner, I stopped by Carter's apartment to drop off some paperwork for the wedding venue. The front door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was Dylan, talking on his cell phone. I was about to call out and announce myself, but the sound of my own name made me freeze in the hallway. "Yeah, man, it's pathetic," Dylan was saying, laughing into the phone. "Carter is basically carrying the guy. Elijah is this uneducated blue-collar dude who just hangs around. He doesn't even have a real job, just does some handyman crap. Carter pays for his truck, probably pays his rent, too." My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to this kid. A kid whose parents paid for his entire college tuition, who had never worked a hard day in his life, completely rewrite my history. "I know, right?" Dylan continued, oblivious to me standing 10 feet away. "Julian was asking me about him the other day. I told Julian the truth. The guy is a total freeloader. He is just leeching off Carter's new salary. You should have seen Julian's face. He was disgusted. Between you and me, I think Julian is trying to get David to talk to a lawyer about drafting an ironclad prenup. They are terrified Elijah is going to try and get his hands on the family money. Prenup. A lawyer. A freeloader. I felt physically sick. Dylan was selling me out to get in good graces with Julian and the wealthy in-laws. He was feeding them exactly what they wanted to hear. A narrative that confirmed all their worst prejudices about people from my background. He was turning my sacrifice into a joke, painting me as a parasite sucking the life out of my successful younger brother. I could have walked into the kitchen right then. I could have grabbed Dylan by the collar of his expensive polo shirt and thrown him out the front door. I could have showed him the bank statements of my development company, proving I made more in a month than he would make in 10 years. But I didn't. I backed out of the apartment silently and pulled the door shut. Why? because I knew if I confronted Dylan, it would cause a massive explosion. Carter would have to kick him out of the wedding party. It would create drama with Chloe's family right before the big day. I swallowed the anger. I buried it deep down in my chest, right next to all the other things I had given up for my brother. I told myself it did not matter what Dylan said. It did not matter what Julian or David thought. They could think I was a broke loser. Let them have their superiority complex. As long as the wedding went smoothly, I could endure a few dirty looks. But sitting in that private dining room, staring down at the card that said, "Uneducated freeloader brother," I realized I had made a terrible mistake. Tolerance is a dangerous game. When you let people step on you without consequence, they do not suddenly realize they are being cruel. They just assume you belong under their boot. By staying silent, by letting David pay for the steak dinner, by ignoring Dylan's lies, I had given them permission to escalate. They did not just want to look down on me privately. They wanted a public execution. They wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone to solidify their dominance over Carter. I looked at the gold calligraphy again. The anger I had been suppressing for weeks finally boiled over. And that brings us back to the moment at the table. The moment the air in the room was sucked out entirely. Carter stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He didn't let go of my arm. His grip was grounding me, keeping me from walking away, keeping me from reverting to the protector who always took the hits in silence. "What did you just say?" Julian asked, his smug smile faltering just a fraction. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to maintain his alpha posture. "Relax, Carter. It's a joke. It's just a little family humor. Don't be so sensitive." Carter didn't look at Julian. He was staring dead at David. "Did you approve this?" Carter asked. His voice was not yelling. It was dangerously calm. The kind of calm that comes before a hurricane rips the roof off a house. David swirled the scotch in his glass, his expression hardening. He hated being challenged, especially in public, and especially by a younger man he considered his inferior. "I approve of honesty, Carter," David said smoothly, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the room. The conversations at the surrounding tables had died down. People were turning in their seats, watching the drama unfold. "Your brother's presence here is an accommodation. We are blending families, yes, but we must also be realistic about the dynamics at play." Julian thought a little humor might break the ice regarding the elephant in the room. "The elephant in the room," Carter repeated, his voice shaking now. "Yes," Sarah chimed in, adjusting her diamond necklace nervously. "We all know Elijah relies on you, dear, and that's fine. Family helps family. But let's not pretend he fits in with this crowd. Julian was just having some fun." I looked at Dylan, who was sitting 2 seats down from Julian. Dylan was staring intently at his water glass, his face pale, sweat forming on his upper lip. He knew exactly where this came from. He knew his lies had built the foundation for this moment. Carter let go of my arm. He reached across the table, grabbed the heavy cardstock with my name on it, and held it up for the entire room to see. "This is humor to you?" Carter asked, his voice rising, carrying to the furthest corners of the restaurant. Before David or Julian could answer, Carter clamped his hands on either side of the card and ripped it cleanly in half. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the silent room. He dropped the torn pieces directly onto Julian's dinner plate. "Hey, watch it," Julian snapped, brushing the paper away from his food. "Carter, please," Chloe whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. She reached out to touch his arm, but he stepped back. He wasn't mad at her, but he was too furious to be softened. "My brother is the only reason I am standing in this room," Carter said, looking directly into David's eyes. "He is the only reason I went to college. He is the only reason I have the career you love to brag to your friends about. When our parents died, he gave up everything. He broke his back so I wouldn't have to. You call him a freeloader? You have absolutely no idea what real sacrifice looks like." David's face turned a dangerous shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against his crisp white collar. He slammed his scotch glass down on the table. "You will lower your voice when you speak to me in this establishment, Carter," David hissed, dropping all pretense of politeness. "You are embarrassing Chloe. You are embarrassing my family." "No," Carter shot back. "You embarrassed yourselves. You just showed everyone in this room exactly what kind of people you are." The tension was so thick you could choke on it. The waiters had stopped moving. The musicians in the corner had stopped playing. Every single eye was locked on our table. And then Julian made the biggest mistake of his life. Julian pushed his chair back and stood up. He was a few inches taller than Carter, wearing a suit that cost more than a used car. He sneered, looking down his nose at both of us. "Oh, please, spare us the tragic orphan monologue," Julian said, rolling his eyes dramatically. "We get it." He laid some bricks. He swung a hammer. "Do you want a medal, Elijah? Do you want us to clap because you did the bare minimum of keeping your brother off the streets?" I felt a muscle jump in my jaw. I stared at Julian, taking in his perfectly manicured nails, his styled hair, his complete lack of any real-world hardship. Julian pointed a finger at me. "You think because you changed a few diapers you're entitled to ride his coattails into our world? Look at you. You're wearing a cheap suit to a five-star restaurant. You don't know which fork to use for the salad. You are a blue-collar nobody who is milking his brother's success because you failed at your own life." He turned to the rest of the room, raising his arms like a terrible comedian seeking applause. "And let's be honest. Dylan told me everything. You don't even have a steady job. You live off Carter's salary. You're practically his dependent. So yeah, the card was accurate. Uneducated. Freeloader. If the shoe fits, wear it back to whatever trailer park you crawled out of." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Even some of David's wealthy business partners looked uncomfortable with the blatant cruelty. Carter lunged forward. He was going to hit Julian. He was going to shatter that smug face right in the middle of the restaurant. But I stepped in front of him. I put my hand flat against Carter's chest and pushed him back. "Don't," I said quietly. "He's not worth the assault charge." I turned slowly to face Julian. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, dangerous authority of a man who has managed construction sites full of hardened criminals and angry contractors. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a razor blade, "the only reason you have that suit on your back is because you were lucky enough to be born into the right hospital room. You haven't earned a single thing in your life. You manage hedge funds? No. You play with daddy's money and pretend it makes you a man." Julian's mouth opened, but no words came out. His face flushed pink. I took a step closer to him. He instinctively took a half step back, suddenly realizing that despite his height, he was standing in front of someone who could break him in half without breaking a sweat. "Dylan lied to you," I continued, glancing over at Dylan, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "But even if it were true, even if I were broke, even if I swept floors for a living, that wouldn't make me less of a man than you. It just means my hands are dirty so someone else's can be clean. You wouldn't know the first thing about that kind of loyalty." Julian recovered his shock and scoffed loudly. "Big words for a guy who is drinking our wine and eating our food. You talk a big game about loyalty, but you're still sitting at a table paid for by my father." That was the trigger. That was the moment David decided he needed to step in and reestablish his dominance. He could not stand seeing his son get dressed down by a tradesman in front of his peers. David stood up slowly, buttoning the center button of his jacket. He looked around the room, offering a tight, apologetic smile to his guests, before turning his dead, shark-like eyes on me. "Enough," David commanded. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man used to giving orders and having everyone scramble to obey. "I will not have my family insulted at my own daughter's rehearsal dinner, especially not by someone of your background." He walked around the table, standing shoulder to shoulder with Julian. "Carter," David said, addressing my brother like a disappointed school principal, I understand you have a misguided sense of loyalty to Elijah. We all have family members we tolerate. But you are entering a different echelon of society now. You need to learn the difference between loyalty and enabling. Enabling? Carter repeated, spitting the word out like poison. Yes, enabling, David said coldly. We have welcomed you, Carter. We have offered you a place at our table. But that invitation does not extend to anyone you choose to drag along. Your brother is disruptive. He is aggressive. And frankly, he lacks the basic refinement required to be in a room like this. Sarah nodded vigorously in agreement. It's true, Carter. Look at the scene he's causing. Julian was just playing a practical joke, and Elijah turned it into a hostile environment. A joke, Carter yelled. You printed Freeloader on a place card. That's not a joke. That's a targeted attack. It was a reminder, David corrected, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper. A reminder of where he belongs, and where he does not. Now, Carter, I am going to give you a choice. You can apologize to my son for your outburst, sit down, and enjoy the beautiful evening I have provided. Or you can leave with your brother. David crossed his arms, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He thought he had the ultimate leverage. He thought Carter was so desperate to marry Chloe, so desperate to be part of this wealthy family, that he would actually throw me under the bus to save his own skin. He severely underestimated the kid I raised. Carter didn't hesitate for a microsecond. He reached up, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and took it off, tossing it over the back of his chair. Chloe, Carter said, his voice softening as he looked at his fiancée. She was weeping openly now, her makeup running down her cheeks. I love you. You know I love you. But I will not marry into a family that treats my blood like dirt. Chloe sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Carter, please. I'm sorry, Carter said, his voice cracking just a little. But if he goes, I go. And the wedding tomorrow is off. The room erupted into furious whispers. David's smug expression shattered. His eyes widened in genuine shock. He never expected Carter to call his bluff. The prospect of a canceled wedding, a massive, high-society event with hundreds of important guests arriving the next morning, was a social catastrophe David could not afford. But David was too proud to back down. His ego would not allow him to lose a standoff to a 20-something kid and a construction worker. You are making a massive mistake, boy, David growled, pointing a shaking finger at Carter. Then, David turned to the corner of the room and snapped his fingers loudly. Gabriel, David barked. The restaurant manager, a tall, impeccably groomed man in a tuxedo, hurried over. Gabriel looked terrified. He knew David was a VIP, but he also knew causing a physical altercation in the dining room would be a disaster for the restaurant. Yes, Mr. Sterling? How can I assist you? Gabriel asked, wringing his hands. I want this man removed from the premises, David said, pointing directly at my chest. Immediately. He is trespassing, he is harassing my family, and he is no longer welcome at my private event. Gabriel swallowed hard. He looked at me, then back at David. Sir, I don't want to escalate. Do it now, or I will make sure this restaurant never sees another dime from my firm. David roared, completely losing his cool veneer. Two large security guards in black suits appeared from the hallway, stepping up behind Gabriel. They looked at me, assessing the situation. I am not a small guy. They knew if they put their hands on me, it was going to be an ugly fight. I looked at the guards. I looked at Gabriel. Then I looked back at David. Nobody needs to touch me, I said calmly, adjusting my cuffs. I am perfectly capable of walking out the door. I turned to Carter. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Carter, listen to me. Don't do this. Do not cancel your wedding over me. You love Chloe. Just sit down. Let me leave. I'll go back to the hotel. No, Carter said fiercely, grabbing his keys from the table. I'm not letting you walk out of here alone. We leave together. How touching, David mocked, sneering at us. The tragic brotherhood endures. Walk away, Carter. Throw away your future. Throw away Chloe. Throw away the connections I can give you. Go back to being a nobody with your nobody brother. I had reached my absolute limit. I took a deep breath, letting the anger settle into a cold, hard focus in my chest. You talk a lot about the future, David, I said, stepping right up to the edge of the table, forcing him to look me in the eye. You talk about your connections, your pedigree. You think your money makes you a king. I leaned in closer. But I've spent my whole life building foundations. And I know what a rotten foundation looks like. You can paint over it, you can put expensive furniture on top of it, but when the storm comes, it crumbles. Your family is rotting from the inside out. You have a son who acts like a bully because you never taught him how to be a man. You have a wife who laughs at cruelty because she has nothing else to offer the world. And you have a daughter who is crying her eyes out right now because she realizes her father is a monster. David's face contorted with rage. Get him out. Now! He screamed at the guards. I'm going, I said, my voice cutting through his screaming. But I want you to remember this moment, David. I want you to remember the moment you tried to humiliate an uneducated freeloader. Because you are about to find out exactly how much you don't know. I turned around and started walking toward the exit. Carter was right beside me, holding Chloe's hand. She had stood up, refusing to let him go, defying her father in front of everyone. Chloe, sit down, David yelled. She ignored him. We walked past the silent tables, past the staring waiters, heading for the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. Stop right there. David's voice echoed through the room. We paused, turning around to look at him one last time. He was standing at the head of the table, his chest heaving, his face a mask of desperate fury. He was losing control and he knew it, so he played the only card he had left. The card he thought gave him absolute power over everyone in the room. The money card. You think you can just walk out of here and cancel the wedding? David yelled across the dining room, not caring anymore who was listening. Do you have any idea how much money I have spent on this weekend? Do you have any idea what this is costing me? He marched forward a few steps, waving his arms at the lavish room around us. Look at this place. Look at the flowers. Look at the food. I rented out the entire top floor of the plaza for the reception tomorrow. I paid for the band. I paid for the catering. I paid for the custom dress Chloe is wearing. He pointed an accusing finger at Carter. You are an ungrateful, insolent little boy. I am footing the bill for the biggest day of your life. My money is creating this wedding. You owe me respect. You owe me an apology. And if you walk out that door, I promise you, I will ruin you. I will call your boss. I will have you fired. I will bury you in litigation for the deposits you're wasting. Carter didn't flinch. He looked at David with pure disgust. Keep your money, David. Keep the flowers. Keep the plaza. I'd rather marry Chloe in a courthouse parking lot than owe you a single dime. You arrogant little punk, David sneered. You think you're so noble, but you're just a coward running away because you can't handle the truth. You and your brother are nothing but parasites. You've been drinking my wine all night, eating my food, enjoying the luxury my hard work provided. And now you spit in my face. David turned to the crowd, his arms spread wide. Ladies and gentlemen, look at them, the great, proud brothers. One is a freeloader, and the other is a traitor. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Go ahead, leave, but know this, neither of you will ever step foot in this restaurant again. Gabriel, he barked at the manager, make sure their faces are on the band list, and bring me the final invoice for tonight. I'm paying it now, just to show these peasants how little their little tantrum affects me. Gabriel looked incredibly uncomfortable. He was holding a leather-bound folder to his chest, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He cleared his throat. Mr. Sterling, Gabriel started, his voice trembling slightly. About the invoice. What about it? David snapped impatiently. Bring it here. I'll put it on my black card. Sir, I can't do that, Gabriel said, looking down at the floor. What do you mean you can't do that? David demanded, marching up to the manager. Is your machine broken? Do you want a check? I will write you a check right now. No, sir. It's not the machine, Gabriel stammered. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. It was a deep, authoritative voice, coming from a private booth near the back of the room. He means he can't bring you the invoice, David, because the bill has already been paid. Everyone turned to look. An older gentleman was standing up from his booth. He had silver hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and wore a simple, elegant dark suit. He walked slowly toward the center of the room. It was Wyatt. Wyatt was a billionaire. He owned the restaurant group that managed this venue, along with dozens of other high-end properties across the country. David had spent the first hour of the evening bragging to his friends about how he had managed to get a table near Wyatt, hoping to network with the legend himself. David's entire demeanor changed instantly. He went from a raging tyrant to a fawning subordinate in a split second. He smoothed his tie and forced a wide, fake smile. Wyatt, sir, David said, stepping forward with his hand extended. I apologize for the disturbance. Just a little family drama. You know how it is. Please, allow me to buy you a drink to make up for the noise. Wyatt ignored David's extended hand. He walked right past him, not even making eye contact. Wyatt walked directly toward me. And then, in front of the entire silent dining room, the billionaire owner of the restaurant stopped in front of me. The man in the cheap suit and the calloused hands. Wyatt bowed his head slightly. Good evening, Elijah, Wyatt said, his voice ringing with absolute respect. I see you're having some trouble. Would you like me to handle this? The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing against your eardrums. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. David was frozen with his hand still extended in midair. His mouth was slightly open. His brain was visibly short-circuiting, trying to process what he had just seen. Why was Wyatt, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the city, speaking to me with such profound respect? Julian dropped his wine glass. It shattered on the floor, spilling red wine across the white tablecloth like blood. But no one even looked down. Sarah gasped, clutching her pearls. Wyatt, I don't understand, David stammered, his confident voice cracking. He looked from Wyatt to me, panic starting to bleed into his eyes. You know this man? Wyatt turned slowly to look at David. The billionaire's eyes were cold, filled with a quiet disdain that was 1,000 times more intimidating than David's screaming. Know him? Wyatt asked, raising a silver eyebrow. David, Elijah is the lead contractor and chief developer for my entire West Coast operations. His firm built this very restaurant we are standing in. He is one of my most trusted business partners. And more importantly, he is a friend. The words hit David like physical blows. He staggered back a step, literally holding onto the back of a chair for support. Developer, David choked out. Partner? No, that's impossible. He's a freeloader. He lives off Carter. He doesn't even have a degree. Wyatt let out a dry, humorless chuckle. A degree? David, Elijah's company grossed over $50 million last year. He employs 300 people. I don't give a damn about a piece of paper on a wall when a man can build skyscrapers with his bare hands and absolute integrity. I looked at Carter. My little brother was staring at me, his eyes wide as saucers. I had kept the scale of my business a secret from him for years. He knew I was doing well, but $50 million? Partner to Wyatt? Carter looked like he was seeing me for the first time. Dylan, standing near the shattered wine glass, looked like he was about to pass out. The lies he had spun to Julian were unraveling spectacularly, wrapping around his own neck like a noose. But the bill, David stammered desperately, clinging to the last shred of power he thought he had. Gabriel, tell him, I paid for this dinner. I gave you my card. Gabriel, emboldened by his boss's presence, finally spoke up, his voice steady now. "Mr. Sterling," Gabriel said, looking David right in the eye, "your credit card was declined 3 hours ago." A collective gasp went up from the surrounding tables. David's business partners started muttering among themselves. The facade was cracking. "Declined!" David shrieked, his face turning ghostly white. "That's impossible. It's a black card. There must be an error with your system. Call the bank." "We did call the bank, sir," Gabriel replied flatly. "Your accounts have been frozen. And quite frankly, we were going to ask you to leave before the entrees were served." David looked like he had been struck by lightning. He was shaking, looking around wildly as his entire world, his entire identity built on wealth and status, began to evaporate in front of an audience. Then who paid?" David whispered, his voice barely audible. "If the card declined, who paid for the dinner?" Wyatt looked at me. He nodded slightly, giving me the floor. It was time. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a folded piece of paper, the receipt Gabriel had quietly handed me when I walked in earlier that evening. I unfolded it slowly, the sound of the crisp paper echoing in the dead silent room. I walked over and placed the receipt directly on top of the torn pieces of the Freeloader place card. "I paid for it, David," I said, my voice echoing off the walls. David stared down at the paper. His eyes tracked the itemized list down to the massive total at the bottom, and finally to the signature line. It was my name, paid in full. "You?" David breathed, looking up at me with sheer terror. "But why?" "Because unlike you, I actually care about my family," I said, stepping closer, looming over him. "I knew your company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 3 months ago, David. My firm bought out 2 of your defaulted commercial leases." The whispers in the room turned into loud murmurs. "Bankruptcy?" one of David's partners said aloud, standing up from his table. "David, what the hell is he talking about?" I didn't stop. I let all the truth out. "I knew you were drowning in debt," I continued, my voice relentless. "I knew the Porsche outside was a rental. I knew the house in the Hamptons was foreclosed on last week. But I didn't say a word. I didn't tell Carter. I didn't tell Chloe." Chloe covered her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably, looking at her father with absolute horror. She had no idea. He had lied to his own daughter to keep up appearances. "I kept your dirty little secret," I said, staring into David's panicked eyes. "When the venue called saying your deposits bounced, I paid them anonymously. When the florist threatened to cancel, I wired them the cash. I spent over $100,000 of my own money in the last month to make sure this wedding happened." I pointed a finger directly at his chest. "I paid for the flowers. I paid for the band. I paid for the dress your daughter is wearing. I paid for the very wine your son is drinking right now while he calls me a freeloader." Julian looked at his empty glass, his face ashen, looking like he was going to vomit. "I did it," I said, my voice dropping to a low, intense growl, "because I wanted my brother to have a perfect day. I didn't want him or Chloe to be embarrassed by your catastrophic failures. I stayed in the shadows. I let you take the credit. I let you sit at the head of the table and pretend you were a king. I picked up the torn half of the place card that read, Freeloader. I flicked it against David's chest. It fluttered to the floor. I let you treat me like garbage because I thought you actually loved your daughter enough to swallow your pride," I said. "But you don't. You only love yourself. You only love the illusion of power. You are a broke, desperate, pathetic man who has to tear down a guy in work boots just to feel tall." David had nothing left. The arrogance, the smugness, the superiority, it was all gone. He looked small. He looked ancient. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to spin another lie, but the room had already turned against him. The storm hadn't just broken. It had completely washed him away. The entire dining room was completely paralyzed. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. That was it. No one moved. No one spoke. The wealthy business partners, The women in their expensive gowns, the waiters holding trays. Everyone was frozen, staring at David. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked at the receipt lying on the table, right on top of the torn pieces of the Freeloader card. He looked at Wyatt. Then he looked at me. His face had lost all its color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The man who had spent the entire evening commanding the room, belittling my job, and treating me like dirt, was suddenly shaking. "This is a lie," David whispered, though he lacked the breath to make it sound convincing. "This is some kind of trick. You don't have that kind of money. You are a contractor." Wyatt took a step forward, his voice cold and sharp. "He is the owner of the largest commercial development firm in the tri-state area, David. He builds the properties you rent, and he pays the bills you default on. You would know that if you spent less time trying to impress people with leased luxury cars and more time managing your failing portfolio." That was the final nail in the coffin. Wyatt, a man whose reputation was built on absolute integrity and billions of dollars, had just publicly confirmed everything. Carter stood next to me. He had been completely silent since I dropped the receipt on the table. I could see the gears turning in his head. He looked from me to David, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, realization, and a rapidly growing fury. Carter reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His thumb swiped across the screen, pulling up his email. "I knew something was wrong," Carter said, his voice deadly calm. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked on his future father-in-law. "A few days ago, the wedding planner accidentally copied me on an email meant for you, David. It was an urgent notice about the venue deposit. They said if they didn't receive the wire transfer by 5 o'clock, they were canceling the event." David swallowed hard. He looked around the room, realizing that his most important business partners were listening to every single word. "I called the planner," Carter continued, his voice rising slightly. "I asked her what was going on. She sounded confused. She told me the balance had been paid in full just an hour prior by a third-party corporate account. I didn't know who it was. I assumed it was one of your shell companies. I assumed you were just moving money around." Carter turned to look at me. His eyes were red. He finally understood. "It was you," Carter said softly. "You paid the venue. You paid the florist. You paid for everything." I nodded slowly. I didn't want to steal the spotlight. I didn't want him to feel indebted to me. I just wanted to protect him. "I couldn't let him ruin your day, Carter," I said quietly. I knew his real estate investments went completely under. I knew he was broke. I just wanted you and Chloe to be happy. Carter turned back to David. The look on my brother's face was terrifying. It was the look of a man who realized he had been played for a fool by a desperate con artist. "You printed a card calling my brother a freeloader," Carter said, his voice vibrating with absolute rage. He pointed at the torn paper on the table. "You sat there, drinking wine he paid for, eating food he paid for, in a room he secured for you, and you tried to humiliate him in front of your friends to make yourself look powerful." Sarah, the mother of the bride, let out a sharp cry. She grabbed David's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "David, what is he talking about?" Sarah demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "What does he mean your investments went under? Tell them they are lying. Tell them about the inheritance. Tell them we are fine." David couldn't look at his wife. He stared at the floor, his shoulders completely slumped. The illusion of his massive wealth had been his armor for decades. Without it, he was just a hollow, terrified old man. "There is no inheritance, Sarah," I said, stepping closer to the table. "David lost everything. His real estate bubble burst 3 months ago. The bank is foreclosing on the summer house. The Porsche outside is rented. He has been putting up a massive front because he was banking on Carter's new salary and promotion at the tech firm to eventually bail him out. He wasn't welcoming you into the family, Carter. He was securing a retirement fund." A collective gasp went up from the surrounding tables. Caleb, one of David's primary business partners, stood up from his chair. He looked disgusted. David, is this true? Caleb demanded, walking over to our table. You asked me to invest $2 million in your new commercial project last week. You told me your company was flush with cash. Were you trying to use my money to cover your personal bankruptcy? David looked up at Caleb, opening his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. Chloe, who had been crying quietly into her hands, slowly lowered them. She looked at her father. The man she had idolized, the man she thought was the pillar of their family, had just been exposed as a total fraud. Dad, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. You lied to me? You lied to Carter? You let us plan this massive wedding, knowing you couldn't pay for it, and then you let Elijah take the financial burden while you treated him like garbage. David reached out toward his daughter. Chloe, sweetie, please understand. I was trying to protect our image. I was trying to figure things out. I couldn't let people think we were failing. Image? Chloe screamed, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. You humiliated the man who raised my fiancée. You sat there and let Julian mock him for not having a college fund, while he was the one secretly saving our entire family from public disgrace. Your image is a lie. Julian, the golden boy, the one who had so proudly delivered the insults just minutes before, was completely silent. He was staring at me, his eyes wide with fear. He finally realized that the man he called an uneducated nobody was actually the one holding the keys to his entire lifestyle. But the reckoning was not over. Carter turned his attention away from David. He looked down the table. He looked right at Dylan. Dylan flinched. He tried to shrink back into his chair, trying to make himself invisible. The arrogant groomsman who loved to name-drop and gossip was suddenly sweating profusely. And you, Carter said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He walked slowly around the table until he was standing right behind Dylan's chair. Carter, man, listen. Dylan started babbling, holding his hands up defensively. I didn't know. I swear to God. I had no idea about his company. I was just making conversation. Making conversation? Carter repeated. He grabbed the back of Dylan's chair and yanked it backward violently. Dylan scrambled to keep his balance, nearly falling onto the floor. You went behind my back, Carter said, staring down at the man he thought was his best friend. You fed Julian lies about my brother. You told them he was a parasite. You told them he lived off my salary. You told them I was carrying him. You tried to ruin my brother's reputation just so you could score some cheap points with Julian and feel like you belonged at the country club. I was just trying to fit in, man, Dylan pleaded, looking around the room for anyone to help him. They kept asking questions. They were judging him. I just gave them what they wanted to hear. You sold out my family, Carter said, his voice hard and cold as ice. The man who practically fought a custody battle to keep me out of the foster system when I was 7 years old. The man who worked construction in the dead of winter so I could eat. You sold him out for a pat on the back from a guy who just lost his trust fund. Carter reached out and pointed a finger directly at the exit. You are done, Carter commanded. You are not a groomsman. You are not my friend. If you ever show up at my apartment or my office again, I will have security throw you out. Get out of my sight. Now. Dylan looked at Carter. He looked at me. He looked at Julian, hoping for some backup, but Julian wouldn't even meet his eyes. Dylan was entirely alone. He scrambled up from his chair. He didn't bother grabbing his suit jacket. He just put his head down and practically ran out of the dining room, pushing past the waiters and disappearing into the lobby. The silence returned to the room. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a battlefield after the final shot has been fired. The enemy was completely destroyed. David was slumped in his chair. Sarah was crying into her napkin, already calculating the social ruin that was about to hit her. Julian was staring blankly at the ruined place card on his plate. The truth had exploded, and it left absolutely nothing of their fake empire standing. The immediate aftermath was brutal. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Caleb, the wealthy investor, shook his head in disgust. He buttoned his jacket, turned to his wife and simply said, "We are leaving. I need to call my lawyer in the morning to pull all my contracts with David." He didn't say goodbye to David. He didn't even look at him. He just walked out of the room. That was the signal. One by one, the other VIPs, the business partners, the society friends that David had invited to show off his wealth, they all started standing up. There was no polite chatter. There were no fake smiles. They grabbed their coats and headed for the doors. "Wait, please," David called out weakly, his voice cracking. He tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to give out. He slumped back into his chair. "Caleb, Mark, please, let me explain. It's just a temporary cash flow issue. I can fix this." Nobody stopped. Nobody listened. In the world David worshipped, weakness was a disease, and bankruptcy was a plague. They were cutting ties instantly to avoid the fallout. Within 5 minutes, the large, lavishly decorated private dining room was completely empty, except for our table, the waiters, and Wyatt. Wyatt walked over to me and offered a firm handshake. "Elijah," he said softly, "I am sorry your evening was ruined. You are a good man. If you need anything, call my private line." "Thank you, Wyatt," I said, shaking his hand. "I appreciate you speaking up. Some things are more important than keeping quiet," Wyatt replied. He gave Carter a respectful nod, then turned and walked out of the room, leaving the restaurant manager, Gabriel, standing awkwardly near the kitchen doors. I looked at David. The man who had demanded I be thrown out into the street was now sitting entirely alone in the wreckage of his own arrogance. His expensive suit looked baggy. His posture was defeated. He looked like exactly what he was, a fraud who had run out of lies. I felt no pity for him. He had built his own grave with his cruelty. He had tried to weaponize his fake wealth to crush my spirit, and it had backfired spectacularly. But as satisfying as it was to see David get what he deserved, my heart broke for Chloe. She was standing next to the table, her hands trembling. She looked around the empty room, looking at the beautiful floral centerpieces, the crystal glasses, the candles flickering on the tables. It was supposed to be the happiest weekend of her life. Instead, it was a nightmare. Carter walked over to Chloe. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around her and pulled her tightly against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder and cried. She cried for the wedding that was ruined. She cried for the father she thought she knew. She cried for the absolute embarrassment her family had caused. I stood back, giving them a moment. I watched Julian slowly stand up from the table. He looked at me, his face pale. He didn't say a word. He just walked past me, looking down at his expensive shoes, and disappeared out the door. He didn't check on his sister. He didn't comfort his mother. He just ran away. Sarah finally stopped crying into her napkin. She looked up, her makeup smeared across her face. She looked at David with absolute pure hatred. "You ruined us," Sarah hissed at her husband. "You ruined my daughter's wedding. You lost our money. I want a divorce, David. I will be contacting a lawyer first thing in the morning." She grabbed her designer purse, stood up, and stormed out of the room without looking back. David was completely alone at the table. He stared blankly ahead, a ruined man. Chloe finally pulled away from Carter. She wiped the tears from her cheeks. She took a deep breath, her spine straightening. She looked at her father one last time. There was no anger in her eyes anymore. There was only a profound, heavy sadness. She reached down to her left hand. Slowly, deliberately, she slid the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. Carter tensed, thinking she was breaking up with him. I held my breath, but Chloe didn't give the ring to Carter. She walked over to the table and placed the diamond ring gently on the white tablecloth, right in front of David. "I can't marry Carter tomorrow," Chloe said. Her voice was remarkably steady now. The tears had stopped. "I refuse to walk down the aisle and pretend everything is perfect. I refuse to let Carter marry into a family built on lies and cruelty." David looked at the ring, then up at his daughter. "Chloe, baby, Please. I am so sorry for what my family did to you, Elijah, Chloe said, turning to look at me. Her eyes were full of genuine remorse. You sacrificed everything for Carter. You paid for my wedding dress, and we treated you like dirt. I will never, ever be able to apologize enough. I shook my head. You don't need to apologize, Chloe. You didn't do anything wrong. You are not your father. Chloe turned to Carter. She took his hands in hers. I love you, Carter. I want to be your wife. But not tomorrow. Not like this. We are canceling the wedding. Carter squeezed her hands. He didn't argue. He knew she was right. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Whatever you want. I'm with you. Chloe nodded. She didn't look back at David. She linked her arm through Carter's arm. Let's go, Chloe said. Carter looked at me. He nodded toward the door. I picked up my coat. I didn't say a single word to David. I didn't need to. The silence in that room was the loudest punishment he could ever receive. We walked out of the restaurant together. The three of us. We left the crystal chandeliers, the expensive wine, and the ruined empire behind us. We stepped out into the cool night air, and for the first time all evening, I felt like I could finally breathe. The next morning, the sun came up, and the absolute destruction of David's life became public knowledge. When you live your entire life obsessed with your image, the fall from grace is incredibly fast and incredibly brutal. Word spreads in those wealthy circles faster than wildfire. By 9 o'clock in the morning, every single guest who was supposed to attend the wedding at the plaza had received a brief, polite email from Carter stating the event was canceled due to unforeseen family circumstances. But nobody needed the email to know why. The guests from the rehearsal dinner had already talked. The story of the arrogant father who printed a freeloader card for the millionaire contractor who was secretly paying his bills became legendary overnight. It was the ultimate karma, the kind of story people whisper about at country clubs for years. David's creditors, smelling blood in the water, pounced immediately. Without the illusion of his wealth, the banks moved in. By noon, the leasing company had sent a tow truck to repossess the Porsche right out of his driveway. The foreclosure on his Hamptons house was finalized. His business partners officially pulled their funding. David was financially, socially, and professionally ruined. And Dylan, the groomsman who sold me out, his karma was just as swift. Carter called Dylan's boss first thing Monday morning. The tech industry is a small world, and Carter was a highly respected rising star. He didn't ask for Dylan to be fired. He simply explained that Dylan had engaged in severe malicious slander against his family and that Carter would no longer be doing business with their firm as long as Dylan was the account manager. Dylan was fired before lunch. He tried to call Carter dozens of times, leaving desperate voicemails apologizing, begging for his job back. Carter never answered. He deleted the voicemails and blocked the number. You reap what you sow. If you build your life on tearing other people down, eventually the ground underneath you collapses. But while David's world was burning down, ours was just beginning to heal. Chloe did not go back to her parents' house that night. She stayed at a hotel. 2 days later, she rented a small, modest apartment across town. She completely cut off all financial ties with her father. Not that there was any money left anyway. She returned the expensive designer clothes, sold her jewelry, and got a job working as an event coordinator at a local nonprofit. She wanted to build her own life. She wanted to prove to herself and to Carter that she was nothing like her parents. About a week after the canceled wedding, I was standing on the second floor of a new commercial building my crew was framing out. I was wearing my hard hat, covered in sawdust, looking over some blueprints. I heard footsteps on the plywood floor. I turned around and saw Chloe. She was wearing a simple pair of jeans and a t-shirt. She looked nervous, holding 2 cups of coffee. She walked over, dodging the extension cords and power tools. "Hey," Chloe said softly, holding out a cup. "I brought you a black coffee." Carter said, "That's how you like it." "Thank you, Chloe," I said, taking the cup. I took off my hard hat and wiped the sweat from my forehead. She looked around the massive construction site. She looked at the steel beams, the concrete foundation, the men working hard under the hot sun. She looked at my calloused, dirty hands. "I never really understood what you did," Chloe said, her voice full of emotion. "My dad always made it sound like it was something to be ashamed of, but standing here, looking at this, you build things, Elijah. You build things that last. My father just built illusions." She looked up at me, tears forming in her eyes. "I came here to thank you," Chloe said. "Not just for the money you spent on the wedding. I will pay you back every single cent, I promise. But I want to thank you for saving Carter. If you hadn't fought for him when you were a teenager, he wouldn't be the incredible man he is today. And if you hadn't stood up to my father last week, I would have married into a lie. You saved us both." I smiled. I reached out and put my dusty hand on her shoulder. "You don't owe me a dime, Chloe," I said gently. "You are family, and family takes care of each other. That's the only foundation that matters." She hugged me then, right there in the middle of the construction site, surrounded by sawdust and noise. And in that moment, I knew Carter had chosen the right woman. She had lost her fake wealth, but she had found her real character. 6 months later, the weather was perfect. The sun was shining, and a gentle breeze was blowing through the oak trees in my backyard. There was no Plaza Hotel. There were no crystal chandeliers. There were no $500 floral centerpieces. And there were certainly no arrogant billionaires judging the waitstaff. Carter and Chloe got married in the backyard of the home I had built with my own 2 hands. It was a small, intimate ceremony. Just 50 people. True friends. Real family. Matthew, my foreman and best friend who had been with me since the early days of hauling gravel, was there. Wyatt even showed up, wearing a casual suit, laughing and drinking a beer on my patio. Chloe looked absolutely breathtaking in a simple, elegant white dress she bought off the rack. Carter couldn't stop smiling. He looked at her like she was the only person in the entire world. There were no place cards at the tables. Nobody needed a piece of paper to tell them where they belonged. We all sat together, eating barbecue, telling stories, and laughing until our stomachs hurt. David was not there. Sarah was not there. Julian was not there. They were dealing with lawyers, bankruptcy courts, and the bitter reality of their new lives. They were completely erased from our world, and honestly, we didn't miss them for a single second. When it was time for the toasts, Carter stood up. He clinked his glass and looked at the small crowd. Then he looked directly at me. "I am a very lucky man," Carter said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am marrying the love of my life today, but I am only standing here because of the man sitting right there." He pointed his glass at me. "When I was 7 years old, my world ended," Carter said. "But my big brother didn't let me fall. He caught me. He gave up his youth. He gave up his college fund. He broke his back so I could walk across a stage and get my degree. He is the strongest, smartest, and most honorable man I have ever known. So please, raise a glass to my best man, to my brother, to my hero." Everyone raised their glasses. They cheered. Chloe looked at me with tears of joy running down her face. I raised my beer bottle in return. I looked down at my hands. The scars were still there. The calluses were still hard. But they didn't look like the hands of an uneducated freeloader anymore. They looked exactly like what they were. The hands of a man who had built a beautiful life. Looking back on that entire ordeal, I realized something incredibly important about human nature. There are people in this world who believe that your worth is determined by the tag on your shirt, the logo on your car, or the title on your office door. They believe that if you work with your hands, if you don't have a fancy degree, you are somehow less than them. They will try to make you feel small so they can feel tall. They will print insults on place cards. They will laugh at your expense. But true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with money. True wealth is the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and know that you earned every single thing you have. It's the peace of mind knowing you didn't have to step on anyone's neck to climb the ladder. It's the absolute, unshakable loyalty of a brother who is willing to throw away his entire future just to defend your honor in a crowded restaurant. David had millions of dollars on paper, but he was completely bankrupt in character. He tried to weaponize his wealth to break my spirit. But you cannot break a man who has already survived the hardest days of his life. You cannot humiliate a man who knows exactly who he is. If you ever find yourself sitting at a table where people are trying to make you feel inferior, remember this. You do not have to shrink yourself to make them comfortable. You do not have to swallow their insults to keep the peace. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up, look them dead in the eye, and let the truth burn their fake empire to the ground. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, dealing with people who mistake wealth for worth? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. Also, if you are still here, listening to my voice right at this very moment, please comment the letter W down below. W stands for winner. It's a secret code for our 1% club, a way for me to recognize the truly amazing people who stayed with me until the very end of the journey. Please hit that like button and follow the channel so we can continue to share more stories together. Stay strong, know your worth, and I'll see you in the next one.